Professor, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Let me start in your own region, though I would like your views on other parts of the world too. The tectonic plates shifted in Beijing when Iran and Saudi Arabia metaphorically kissed and made up. That's pregnant with all kinds of good things, isn't it? Not only is it good for Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's good for the neighborhood. It's good for the prospects of resolving long-running conflicts in the neighborhood. How did it all come about?
I'm sure you recall that a little over 3 years ago, the Iraqi prime minister, after the United States under Trump murdered General Soleimani, the Iraqi prime minister said that General Soleimani was actually going to Baghdad to meet him. He was supposed to meet the prime minister early in the morning at 8 a.m. to discuss a letter from Saudi Arabia, which was sent to discuss decreasing tensions. So General Soleimani was basically in Baghdad to de-escalate or find a way to de-escalate between Iran and Saudi Arabia with the help of the then Iraqi Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi. After Trump murdered him, there was it took a while before the Iraqi government again attempted to mediate between the two sides. Again, Iran and Saudi Arabia both accepted. And there were a number of rounds of negotiations that mostly took place in Iraq. There was progress, but it didn't lead to a deal. Later on, the Chinese President Xi, when he traveled to Saudi Arabia, in his meetings with Saudi leaders, it was discussed, or the issue of mediation was discussed between them. And after he returned to China and before President Raisi's trip to Beijing, a message was sent to Iran about the idea of mediation, what the Saudis and the Chinese discussed. When President Raisi went on his state visit to Beijing, during the negotiations, he agreed to have the Chinese mediate, and the rest we all know. Last week, the two sides were able to come to an agreement and reestablish ties with one another. So I think that was a major plus for China, because it showed Chinese behavior to be very different from that of the United States. While the Chinese are trying to decrease tensions and to decrease hostility, the Americans have, in the eyes of most people, I would assume, in our region, they have been after division and after exploiting divisions and increasing potential rifts between the different countries. And I think the Chinese have actually, by behaving almost the exact opposite of that of the United States, they've made the Americans look even worse. And of course, because of this rapprochement, I think there is a good opportunity that there will be more movement with regards to Syria. The Saudis in the past, as you know, were supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, as well as in Iraq, along with a host of other countries, NATO countries and non-NATO countries. Now, hopefully, there is talk, or the Saudis have said that they wish to change the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Syria. So that's good news. They have been making some positive noise on Lebanon, and hopefully the Saudis will find the will to bring about peace in Yemen as well. So I think that this could be a first step to decrease tensions across the region, which of course will make both Americans and the Israeli regime very unhappy.
Well, I was going to turn to Israel. We'll come back to the United States if we have time. But Israel, of course, publicly expressed its anger at this deal in Beijing. And lo and behold, there are reports this evening about an alleged IED attack by Hezbollah in the northern part of Israel, and the briefing to the media that Israel may very well launch an attack on Lebanon to, as it were, avenge it. This can be directly related, can't it, to the breakthrough in Saudi-Iranian relations?
Yes, the Israeli regime is looking for a means to distract public opinion away from problems at home. On the one hand, the divisions in Israeli society are clear for everyone to see. People have seen the protests. Israel is a very right-wing society, but the current regime led by Netanyahu is extremely right-wing, so right-wing that even the Europeans and especially the Americans are criticizing it, something that we don't often see. And the attacks on Syria, for example, that we've seen over the past couple of weeks since the earthquake, they were carried out to distract attention from the problems at home. And I think that what the Israeli regime right now is contemplating with regards to Lebanon is probably the same, because if they carry out an attack on Lebanon, then they will definitely bring about war. Hezbollah will not stand indifferent, and the Israelis have already lost a war to Hezbollah less than 2 decades ago. But I think Netanyahu really is so desperate to remain in power and to distract public opinion away from the problems that he has at home, even though I think he has the majority, he has a support base that could keep him in power, but I think he needs to distract attention away from this, and he's willing to do anything. He has, I mean, to say that a Zionist has principles is a bit problematic, but in his case, he has no principles whatsoever.
You got to hand it to them for chutzpah, though. Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister of the European Union, has today been refused entry to Israel. Israel is a country that only exists on the largesse and the political and diplomatic indulgence of the European Union and the United States. Heaven knows we even let them play in the European football tournaments, though they're not European. Well, they are European, but they're not in Europe. We even let them into the Eurovision Song Contest. And yet they can slam the door in the face of the foreign minister of the European Union. You've got to hand it to them. They know how far they can push those who pay them, don't they?
Yes, and they can push very far. And Netanyahu, once upon a time, said something similar about the United States. He always felt that he knew how to handle the United States, and he believed that he can get away with literally anything. And the same is true in Europe. The irony, of course, is that the head of the European Union foreign policy apparatus himself is quite a racist. When he spoke about the European Union being a garden and literally almost all of the rest of the world being a jungle, many people were quite stunned, but he never really withdrew the remark. He tried to explain it, but it was obvious what he was talking about. And that is very similar to the attitude of the Israelis. They too see the Palestinians and the Palestinian people as part of the jungle, just like the Americans who see themselves as a shining city on a hill, an exceptional country. They all of them share the same mentality when it comes to viewing the rest of the world. So even though Joseph Borrell and the Israelis have a great deal in common, but it is ironic that the Israelis who need the Europeans behave that way to the Europeans, and we all know that nothing will happen. There will be no punishment, there will be no meaningful condemnation. The Israelis will just continue to move on, get their support, crush the Palestinian people, and the story will move on to something else.
Now, I want to take you just for a few minutes, if I may, Professor, to a different part of the garden. Australia is, of course, not in Europe, though it is ruled by Europeans, just like Israel, just like the United States. So I guess by extension, they are fellow denizens of the garden. And there this week sat the three leaders of USACA, or AUKUS as they more politely call it: Australia, United Kingdom, and USA. The optics were dazzling for me, especially when I spotted Victoria Newland in the front row. She'll definitely want a front row seat for World War III. But I wondered if they knew just what a tiny bubble they looked like. They looked like three men in a bubble, talking as if they represented the world, whilst in fact representing an ever-shrinking part of the world. This Anglo-Saxon bubble, although Rashid Sunak is only an honorary Anglo-Saxon, if you get my meaning. How did it look to you?
It looked the same, and the United States is the side that wins in this agreement. The Australians are the ones who are going to suffer the consequences. Just like the Europeans who are being sacrificed by the Americans, the Australians are being sacrificed by the Americans too. They're going to be forcing them to pay an enormous amount of money, which will be enormously beneficial for the US military. And on the other hand, they're going to only create hostility and anger in Beijing. And we're also seeing other countries in Southeast Asia beginning to react to this agreement, because it is contrary to what the Americans and the Europeans like to say, the European leaders and American leaders. The global South is not sympathetic to the United States. It's not sympathetic to Australia. And it's not sympathetic to any part of NATO and its operations, regardless of the fact that the war in Ukraine is, in my view, and in the view of many, mostly a problem that NATO has created. But regardless of all that, one reason why people are not sympathetic to the Ukrainian government is because they've seen so much suffering caused by Western powers across the world, across Africa, across the Americas, across Latin America, across Asia. Very few people, very few countries have gone unscathed, if any, because of their interaction with Western powers in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So people, let's say, they just have a tendency, they just they regardless of the nature of the conflict, they just like to see the U.S. lose. And what Australia is doing is that by becoming a part of this foolish alliance, a country which has, I think, a population of a bit less than 26 million, they are putting their own citizens at risk. They are antagonizing the people across the region that have a dark history with the United States, and they are antagonizing the country, meaning China, that is the source of a great deal of the wealth of the people of Australia.
Indeed, it's the biggest trading partner. And maybe some of them have forgotten how the current Australia came into being in the first place, having been conquered by settlers and the actual Australians being systematically, genocidally wiped out. And then we sent some criminals there. I suppose that's what we did with the USACA meeting again. Thank you, Professor Marandi, for joining us